Humbity bum bada bum 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 ba dum 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 dum. Diddly dee 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 dee. Well, hello and welcome, whoever you are, wherever you are, whenever you are, however you got here. Thank you for showing up. Denise Matto here. I just wanted to share some thoughts, kind of random thoughts about Christian nationalism. That's a phrase that's been showing up in a lot of chatter and video discussions lately. And it's an interesting concept because too often people approach a concept like that from the point of view of where we are today, in terms of what is a nation today. And what happens when you combine a specific religion with the concept of a nation. And we tend to forget that our modern government system all around the world, all the different countries, tend to follow a kind of style of organization that is actually quite new. If you go back just a few centuries, you go back into the feudalism where it was kings and their fiefdoms and nobles and their castles. Then there was a time when you didn't even really identify land or territory inside borders as a particular nation. People identified more with, oh, those people over there belong to this tribe or that tribe by virtue of their language and the way they dressed and lived, because a lot of them were nomadic. So you could actually have the same land occupied by two or three different nomadic tribes who got along by leaving each other alone. But they would, if one was in an area of that land at one point, the other would be somewhere else. If they came into conflict, you'd have a tribal war of some kind. And so if you look at history going all the way back to the beginning of Christianity, the concept of nationalism, it really isn't related to the concept of a religion. It's a modern form of government organization. And then I was thinking about the fact that in a lot of the literature I like to read from the Middle Ages and that period of time, King Arthur's time, okay, which would go back to, I guess Arthur was in the period of Britain after the Romans left, so post-Roman Empire, and Christianity had pretty much taken over. And the interesting thing about Christianity in the British Isles is that it was really brought in by the Romans. Unlike Christianity in the Mediterranean, which emerged from the Jews and Greeks through people like Paul and the apostles. And it spread through various groups in different ways. And the Roman Empire was bordered by land borders, which is interesting. The Greek civilization consisted of a lot of different city-states that identified themselves as Greek because they all spoke Greek and they had similar customs and styles, but governing each other, they governed separately. They weren't organized by a central king or a Caesar like in Rome. And it occurred to me that maybe Rome was one of the first large territorial empires because Rome had built its strength on its roads. The fact that Rome could predict if the Caesar in Rome, in the city of Rome, said, okay, we're going to send troops out to Jerusalem, they knew exactly how long it would take for troops from different areas to get there. So they could plan. Whereas before you had this kind of sophisticated technology of roads, a king who wanted to attack a distant kingdom, he really took a chance of, okay, we're going to send an army out, and just kind of generally figure when are they going to get close and we can plan accordingly. So basically I think that because of the road system, and this is just me talking, I'm no expert, no scholar, but because of the roads, Rome might have been one of the first empires to really focus on enclosing land, because they built Hadrian's Wall up in between England and Scotland. They really started to lose their power when they faced the German frontier. But they had these frontiers. And other times, other empires would control cities, but in between the cities, the open wilderness was kind of like anybody could travel through. And the concept of a religion being the ruling factor, again, I'm no scholar. I'm no, I'm just thinking. Um, Organized religion seems to be very urban. I mean, if you consider Egypt, for example, urban society, they had the scribes and the priests and all the various levels of things that they did with their temples and their preparations for death and all this other stuff that they were so involved with. And most of these other civilizations were based on a king building a great city and then having the power to send people out to rule other places, but it was very fluid. And so bringing it up to now, and we've got these people talking about, some people are talking positively about the idea that we should establish Christian nationalism to bring our country back from the chaotic mess that it's in. I don't really agree with that, but I know that's what some people think. And others use the phrase Christian nationalism as a boogeyman, that, that means Nazis and Hitler, which is interesting because Hitler was actually occult nationalism. A very interesting character in the YouTube universe, in social media, is an Irish pagan named Thomas Sheridan, who opened my eyes to a lot of things. There's a lot of that he says that I just kind of laugh at, but he did open my eyes to a couple of things. And one of them was, he said, people think that the Nazi Party was a political party that dabbled in the occult. But in reality, it was an occult society that dabbled in politics. And I think that a lot of that still goes on today. And if you, okay, so now look at Rome, and the Protestants are still absolutely obsessed with the Pope. Ugh. Come on. But, and they believe that the Vatican has all kinds of power that it never had and never will have. But the Protestants live off their own lies. Anyway, there was a time when the Vatican held temporal power over kings and stuff. And people in that time would refer to Christendom. Was this land or that land part of Christendom? Which pretty much is very similar to the concept of Christian nationalism, except, again, in those times when you didn't have such tight communication globally that you have today, it was a little more fluid. And quite often, the nobility of a country that was considered to be a Christian country because the nobility, the kings or whoever had said, you know, don't mess with the Christians. Let them be, you know, give them free right to have their churches and monasteries. Quite often, those kings did not get baptized as Christians themselves until quite late in life. In fact, it was considered kind of unlucky because there's a Catholic teaching that the worst sins, the ones that will get you sent to hell, they're the ones that you are conscious of as a sinner. And so the kings used to consider there was a loophole. They thought there was a loophole. But actually, if you think there's a loophole, then you're screwed, because it means you know what you're doing. The idea was that an unbaptized person may be committing grievous sin, but not know that it is grievous sin. Therefore, they're not necessarily going to be condemned to hell. But if you're Catholic and you do the same grievous sin because you've been baptized and you therefore declare that you know who Christ is and you know about the devil, well, then you're going to go to hell. So even Emperor Constantine did this. For all that he declared Christianity to be the official religion and all this other stuff, you know, credited with bringing Christianity up into the forefront, he actually did not get baptized until he was practically on his deathbed. For that same reason, that it was considered unlucky. If you got baptized too early, you had too much time to commit serious sin. But anyway, I digress. The thing is, the concept of Christendom is something that is a little bit more acceptable in my eyes than the concept of Christian nationalism, because Christian nationalism immediately puts the spiritual power and rule of Christ into the political, temporal, profane rule of the flesh. And the spiritual rule of Christ is supposed to be on our hearts. And because of that rule on our hearts, well, then in the flesh, we will act like Christians. Therefore, a country that's made up of Christians could be considered as Christendom. It's the people's hearts are affected by that belief system and not affected by political propaganda. But as soon as you start declaring that, well, if you're Christian, you've got to be all okay with Christian nationalism, well, then no, that means you start pulling the political, overt, temporal, fleshly conflicts into the front part. And they belong off to the side. Because, you know, maybe if you actually hold elected office, if you actually hold a position of power or authority, most people don't. Most of us are just living day to day. We don't have any real power over anybody. And we really need to just live our lives as best we can. And in Christendom, that means most of us would be doing the best we can to live peacefully, provide for our loved ones, don't run around beheading infidels, you know, don't pick fights over stupid stuff, don't pick fights at all. And if you're pushed into a corner where you have to defend yourself, take a minute to pray before you take any action, and take only what action is necessary. It's like the self-defense law in the United States. You know, you can't just haul off and shoot someone because you thought they were going to rob you. Your force against the person who's attacking you has to be related to protecting yourself and getting away from the attacker. If you don't have to kill the attacker to get away, you don't have the right to do it, you see. And so a Christian pushed into the corner needs to be able to rely on faith. Show me what to do, Lord. Do I stand up to this guy? What do I do? And there's no clear answer to that because it's in the heart. And the Lord, Christianity is a religion of the individual by all of its power is in the individual relationship with Christ. Yes, we have rules that, the 10 Commandments. We have things like the Apostles' Creed, and a lot of different denominations have various little principles that they hand all their congregants and say, this is what, if you're going to call yourself a member of this particular Christian group, this is what you believe. And they have to agree to this or that set of doctrines. But that's really just a form of identifying fellowship. The real power of Christianity does not come from a national set of rules. And in fact, you can be in a country which totally outlaws Christianity, someplace like China, but people can still have Christ in their hearts, depending on how creative they are in getting access to forbidden teachings. They can get access to Bibles in different ways. And I think China's a lot less, because of technology, the communications, that China's a lot less controlled than it was, although it's still tightly controlled. And maybe they only approve Christian groups that adhere to government principles that are, frankly, in most cases, anti-Christian. But the heart of the people, the collective of individuals, it's like Christianity is very fractal. And that's why the concept of Christian nationalism just can't work. It will never work. No religion actually works as a national set of laws and rules and practices, except if it does something like what the Nazis did or like what the Communist Party did. And it's interesting because communism is thought to be atheistic and secular, but yet Karl Marx was basing a lot of his stuff on Hegel, and Hegel was a religious person. He had developed some kind of Protestant style belief system of his own, which turned into Marxism. Not Christian at all, but still very religious. And so whenever you have any party that tries to impose a religious belief system on the people, it doesn't go well. A lot of people are worried because Donald Trump does have some pretty wild people around him. People who are into the Christian nationalism stuff. I don't think that many really, but some are. But in watching Donald Trump, he's a pragmatic person. He's willing to let those people kind of have a lot of room to express themselves because it helps his base, his voter base. But the decisions he makes, there's a palmetto bug up there on the wall. That is a palmetto. I hate palmetto bugs. It's been so rainy lately, and they come in the house when it rains. I don't know why. But anyway, I digress. The trolls are going to have fun with that. Oh, the trolls went nuts a few years ago when one of them got into the house and landed on my shoulder. And I didn't even think about it. I just flicked it off and kept talking. And these were northerners, these trolls. And northern people think that that's a cockroach. It's a cousin to a cockroach, but it's an outdoor bug that occasionally gets inside, especially when you have palm trees all around. That's why they call them palmetto bugs. But anyway, I digress. Yeah, anyway, I'm thinking about that. And I'm thinking, well, on the one hand, if the government leans towards Christian nationalism, that's okay with me because, for the most part, Christian nationalists don't run around beheading people. But if people focus on Christian nationalism, they tend to twist it to the point where they might be just as bad. And they justify their violence. That's the problem with that word nationalism. Nationalism tends to relate to defending your country, defending the nation. It sort of primes you for violence in the interests of political defense. Whereas Christendom doesn't really do that. If you think of it as Christendom, we want Christendom. We want the values and teachings of Christ to be what rules people's hearts. But that doesn't entangle you with the violence of warfare. It doesn't predispose you to think in defensive terms. Christendom predisposes you to think in how do we live our lives terms. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Christian nationalism. And I guess I'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you for showing up. Denise Matteau, over and out.